Hello everybody, and thank you for coming today. As Alex just explained, our talk today will be focusing on the Catchment Plan. This is a new and innovative project which is using ArcGIS StoryMaps and collections with the aim to focus and streamline and simplify long-term flood mitigation and to help residents understand the sources of flooding and what we as the council are doing to alleviate it. We hope that following this presentation, you will feel inspired to use story maps to solve your own challenges within your own organisations.
I will apologise now, we are not GIS professionals, but as Mark Enser was talking about this morning, we do understand the importance of data informing and making and allowing you to make good decisions. What you can see here is just some of the events that just the London Borough of Hillingdon have experienced in the last few years. The London Borough of Hillingdon is the second largest London borough, just furthest west. In London, we've experienced multiple events, as you can see, affecting local residents, requiring evacuation, and multiple events from different sources, from fluvial events, from surface water. Surface water is where the water can't be absorbed into the ground. And in 2016, particularly, we experienced a really bad event where over 80 residents were flooded in 34 different locations. So the importance of collecting that data and being able to use it was significant in trying to understand what to do and how to inform our future plans and projects. Obviously, if you've attended this morning, you'll know that flooding is likely to be getting worse, and particularly in the southeast. We're likely to experience possibly drier summers, but more intense rainstorms, which are likely to exacerbate the likelihood of events like this occurring on a more regular basis. And if you were in London last July, you probably got drenched in a few downpours in London, in central London. As a borough, we have about 5,000 people that are affected from fluvial flooding, but we have approximately 30,000 people that are likely to be affected by surface water. However, surface water is much less well understood because often it is going into the drainage systems below ground through the roads, and it means that data is not collected in the same way or the same format or published. And mapping of those areas of surface water risk have only been published in the last few years. Quite often we rely on reporting of flood events, and particularly where there are significant areas of deprivation, we get less flood reporting. And in addition, when trying to deliver projects, there are many private companies with large land holdings that make it difficult to develop flood alleviation projects where there are multiple stakeholders involved. Many of the projects we've had in the past were reactive based on where we had reports of flooding, not where could flood, and not where might have flooded, but not had reported. So to understand the issues across Hillingdon and what we needed to reduce the flood risk, I came up with the concept of a catchment plan. This was an innovative idea, collecting and understanding data and identifying where the gaps in data were, mapping those below ground catchments and using these to prioritise catchments and develop a pipeline of projects on where to store water and where we wanted to develop future projects, and being more proactive in our decision making to enable us to develop a longer term programme to protect the residents better. We secured funding from the Environment Agency to fund a pilot and explore ways to develop and visualise the plan using GIS. So what we did, I recruited Louise as a project officer to help deliver the catchment. And in trialling different options, we selected story maps as providing a critical way of creating a web page with an easy-to-use structure and an integrated way of using GIS, visualising complex data, but that was quick to learn to use. The benefits we're already seeing we've already published parts of this catchment plan and used aspects in flood forums with residents to show how we're using the data that they are reporting, which is critical to help them understand the value of the data that we're collecting and then using, and to show how multiple events across a wide area are interlinked. And the future, we need a solution to deliver information to the council, residents and stakeholders and the public in a transparent and easy to digest way, and StoryMap's provided that solution. So the project genesis, as you can see, we have particularly large amounts of people who are interested in flooding in comparison to other emergencies. We had multiple more visits to the flooding pages in comparison to all of those other emergencies. But whilst the website contained lots of useful information about flood risk, resident feedback was this was a particularly complex area and could be more visual and easily accessible. As you can see, there are multiple plans as a local authority that we have to produce, all of which are statutory with their own goals and duties, such as the ones highlighted on here: local plans, flood investigations, flood asset registers, and preliminary flood investigations. And therefore, in each of those, we have to produce maps which show a lot of different flood risk information. This is very complex, and to communities, they are very difficult to understand. For example, did you know, if you want to find out if your area was flooded, that you need to look at the Section 19 flood investigations published by the council? Previously, this was published just as a document and was not accessible to compare data across plans or changes that may have occurred over time, and hence the selection of StoryMaps.
So I'm going to quickly speak now about the StoryMaps, but I just thought I would start by emphasising that the data that was used in this from all the different sources. The first stage was for us to collect all these GIS data sets. As Vicky said, there's a lot of infrastructure in the borough and a lot of stakeholders. So for example, we had to collect information from Thames Water, Heathrow Airport, Brunel University, the Environment Agency, Canals and River Trust, Transport for London, National Rail, National Highways, collect all this information so we could really understand where was at risk and where potential surface water flooding could occur. This was probably one of the most arduous tasks, but it definitely emphasised to us how this needs to be visual. So from here, we created each story map for each phase of the project, as you can see here, and added them to a collection. This made our aims and objectives clearer, easy to navigate, and we think it looks more stylish. I'm now going to give you a run through of what we've completed so far, and this is for the phases 2, data creation, phase 3, and phase 4. So, phase 2 was data creation, and we had 5 main data sets we needed to update. The first was flood history. So following significant flooding events, we as the council collect information from these residents. As Vicky mentioned, to find out if your area had been flooded, you would have to go through the flood investigation PDFs, and that would be based on your postcode area. This is not an effective way of keeping residents aware of their flood risk, so therefore we thought we had to improve this. To make this information more accessible, we have used the sewer drainage areas, which we'll mention in a minute, to sum the number of events in each area. Doing this means it's more localised rather than based on postcodes, but it still provides that confidentiality for flood-affected people. The next one was ordinary watercourses layer. As a lead local flood authority, we lead on ordinary watercourses, which are rivers, ditches, channels, streams, canals, culverts, which aren't main rivers, so are not managed by the Environment Agency. Since 2014, the number of ordinary watercourses in our borough has increased by 62%. This is because previously unknown watercourses have been discovered through site visits, planning applications, and improvement to LiDAR. So these need to be recorded so we can understand where it is actually at risk. The next data set was our watercourse catchments. Whilst there are already catchments that did this, so like above ground sort of drainage areas, these did not factor in the newly identified ordinary watercourses. Discussions with residents highlighted the importance of knowing how overland flows move through an area. So for example, how their actions upstream, so for example in Northwood at the top there, could affect people at the downstream end of the catchment. As a result, we now have 43 above ground watercourse catchments. The fourth was the sewer drainage areas. The importance of mapping these is to understand the true volume of water through a system, as it shows us the number of people in a drainage area where capacity could be close to full. So for example, there's a lot of different areas, a lot of properties draining to this one outfall here, so that could be a pinch point. For these areas, we collected information from Thames Water, Heathrow Airport, Brunel University. Given the intricacy of the drainage network, as shown here in red, some of them were flagged as either unknown or unconfirmed. These were flagged that we should try and confirm them in future via survey. We had 509 of those catchments. The next data set was asset register. So the flood assets are any feature that would cause an increased flood risk if it were absent, modified, or not appropriately maintained. As we have collected drainage information from a variety of sources, the register needed to be updated. Having this mapped means it's easier for us to monitor these assets and see where could potentially exacerbate flooding. So the next phase was phase 3, which is prioritisation and risk assessment. We needed to focus projects where people were most at risk, therefore we needed the catchments to be rated to show this risk. We reviewed existing formula regarding the risk and vulnerability, for example here with the Flood Vulnerability Index. However, this had a lot of different sort of variables that we thought were not suitable for this project, and it was discounted. Additionally, it was noted in the difficulty of having a static value, so one which we couldn't change based on different features. Land ownership, deprivation, and air quality, these are things that can affect the amount of funding that we as a council can get. So we needed to make sure that the risk was not just based on exposure, but then we could see where we could get the projects up and running in areas that fit those different criteria. So therefore we created a dynamic value instead, as I say, so we can filter them so it's not just being on surface water and fluvial risk. So we knew that flood zones, groundwater and flats could be influencing the results. The first was flood zones. So in both of these examples, there are 15 properties at risk. However, scenario 1 has 4 in flood zone 3B and scenario 2 has 9 in flood zone 3B. If we just did it on number of properties alone, they would technically have the same risk, but that isn't the case. So we had to decide to count them twice in each flood zone to truly reflect the difference. The next one was groundwater. The susceptibility data was used, and a lot of areas have a high number of groundwater risk. As a borough, we have no records of groundwater causing internal flooding to properties, and as the areas are usually along river corridors and fluvial floodplains, we did not include groundwater in our exposure as it was skewing it too much. Flats are also areas that we had to screen. The information we used to show properties did not differentiate between floors, so all of the flats in a building were considered at flood risk, even though it was just the ground floor that we were concerned with. These areas were high-risk areas, so Brunel University Hall of Residence and Station Approach, they were really high areas of flats, and that you can see it was skewing the results from there. So the next phase we have here is the different prioritised catchments just based on the risk. So these are just the top 10 that we came across. So the final stage was phase 4, which is options appraisals, and this focused on the opportunities we'd incorporate in a 25-year plan. So other organisations and companies have created these different GIS datasets for us. So this included natural flood management, sustainable drainage systems, and green infrastructure. So we use these as a base for our analysis to see where projects could be created. It was also noted in this section the importance of planning. So as a borough, we already have areas flagged for large redevelopment or sites that have been flagged as new homes as part of the London plan, as shown in this map. For an example of how important planning is, 2 large sites that have been regenerated in the last few years have had their total runoff reduced from 2,600 litres a second that's going off-site to 400 litres a second off-site. So this is equivalent to them storing 1.5 Olympic-sized swimming pools on-site in a 30-minute rain event. For the outline projects, we also considered the volume of water that was included and the capital cost of the projects as well. And we did this through the calculators provided by the EA, but also projects we've done in the past, we had an approximate value of how much they cost and we could go from there. We also thought we'd incorporate an aspiration for each project. So the more pillars of SUDs that they meet, the better the score. So at the minute, all of them were trying to aim to reduce the quantity. However, if we could then improve water quality or create amenity space, that would mean it was a better project. All of the projects that we've considered so far have been added to a map, which includes their cost, volume, and aspiration grade, as well as a little description of what they are. A lot of the projects that were brought forward, however, were smaller retrofit projects. So as you can see here, however, we tried to aim to make a train of them so we could slowly reduce the flow as it went through a catchment. To convey all of this complex information in a solely written format, it was difficult, confusing, and not engaging. StoryMap showed us how easy it was to map and present it in a visual way, and the real benefit of StoryMaps it was intuitive to get started. As I said, I'm not a GIS expert like we've seen here today. However, I managed to do all of this, and it was easy to interact with, and it's very easy to update and republish over time. So the next slide is the benefits we're seeing already. So we've recently taken our first steps in securing funding from a local hospital to alleviate flooding on site and upstream. So the hospital in question said they couldn't store water on their site. However, because we had the story maps and we had the catchment plan and we had the projects, we could quickly put together some ideas that they could do off-site. So for example, the detention basins and the swales were already things that we'd flagged. By having this information at hand, it was easy to get this sort of done and given to them in the planning stage, which makes it easier for this project to go forward. Also, due to the innovative nature of story maps, we've also created other story maps while we've been doing this, of projects that we already have within the borough, an example being Besingby Park and Pine Gardens flood alleviation. One of the key points of this was to try and make it accessible to the public, so it's really good to see that it's already being used in sort of forums and people have already been reading it, understanding it, and passing it on to other residents within the community.
The future for us as a council is making flood risk information more transparent. So we're going to continue to work on making the data we've collected more available to the public. The map on the right of your screen is the map of flood assets data that we've collected from multiple sources. We're going to continue using it in our Section 19 flood investigation reports so we can explain those clearly to residents, and we can use the timelines, pictures, and put this all in one place and still link it to PDF documents using story maps. The interaction that this gives us in working with the public in flood forums to help the residents understand how each individual report links together is absolutely critical when you're asking communities to be involved in future flood schemes. And ultimately, we want to promote and ensure that all the departments within the council are working together to deliver schemes, so whether it's our highways team, our green spaces, or ourselves in putting forward projects, so that we all have a clearer view of what we want to do. The possibilities are endless, and many of the talks this morning have given us more inspiration about what we would like to do in the future. So I really hope this presentation has helped you appreciate the power of story maps and inspired you to think about how you could use that to solve the challenges in your organisation, especially where you need to understand complex data like flood risk in an easy to digest visual form, which leads to better, more effective and efficient decision making. Thank you.